Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Welcome to the first session of our conference. We're so excited to have very excellent three professors and experts in this field. I am very happy to be in their company and very glad to introduce them to you. The session title is Islamophobia and the Geopolitical Context of the War on Terror. First, before I start introducing our speakers and the conference and the topics that they will be speaking about, just to remind everybody that you can find our link to the conference on our website as well as on SIGA's Facebook. In fact, it is being broadcast from the SIGA Facebook account of our center. The speakers that we have today that will inaugurate this conference with, they come from three different backgrounds, but all of them have been focused on this issue of Islamophobia, but in a global sense, beyond the narrow sense of what global Islamophobia is about. And here we're trying to address it again from the perspective of geopolitics. The first speaker is going to be Professor Jasmine Zane. She will be speaking about Islamophobia in the service of empire. Professor Zane is a professor of sociology and Muslim studies at Wilfrid Laurier University in Ontario, Canada. She has completed a 6-year-long national study between the years of 2009 and 2015 on the impact of 9/11, the war on terror, and domestic security discourses and policies on Canadian Muslim youth. She's currently finishing a book manuscript based on this study, which tentatively titled Under Siege, Islamophobia and the 9/11 Generation. Dr. Zane is also an affiliated faculty member with the Islamophobia Research and Documentation Project at the University of California, Berkeley, and serves on the editorial board of Critical Muslim Studies journal Reorient. She's currently working on a research study that focuses on mapping the Canadian Islamophobia industry. The second presentation would be by Professor Mary Breen Smith from the University of Massachusetts in Boston. And that lecture is titled Terrorism and the Politics of Islamophobia, Examining the Big Questions. Professor Breen Smith is a visiting professor at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. She's also a professor emerita at the University of Surrey in the United Kingdom and a research fellow at the National Peace Center at the University of Otago in New Zealand. Dr. Breen Smith is also the founder of the Institute for Conflict Research in Belfast, Ireland, and joint founder of the Taylor and Francis Journal titled Critical Studies on Terrorism. She has published books and articles and made films about political violence, the impact of war on populations, victim politics, suspect communities and race, and research ethics and methods. Our third and final speaker is Professor Ramon Crossfield from the University of California at Berkeley, United States. And the title of his presentation is The War on Terror, Defining the Language, Analyzing the Politics. Dr. Ramon is an associate professor in the Department of Ethnic Studies at the University of California in Berkeley. He received his bachelor's degree in sociology from the University of Puerto Rico in 1979, his master and PhD degrees from Temple University in urban studies in sociology. And Dr. Crossfield is internationally recognized for his work on decolonization of knowledge and power, as well as for his work in international migration and political economy of the world system. He's been a research associate of the Maison des Sciences de l'Homme in Paris for many years. So it gives me a pleasure first to start with Dr. Zane. Each of our speaker has about 22 minutes to give their presentation, and then we'll open it for a Q&A. Dr. Zane.
Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum. And it's a pleasure to be here with the co-panelists today and to be starting off our conversation. So I also want to offer greetings from Canada. I'm joining you from the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Huron, Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit, here on Turtle Island. I wanted to begin by acknowledging the colonial theft and violence upon which this nation was built, and honor the Indigenous history and struggles that persist amidst this imperial legacy. This land acknowledgement is especially important in light of the topic that I was asked to speak about today, which is Islamophobia in the service of empire. Now, as Alan McHale reminds us, when Columbus landed in the Americas, he was imprinted with the vestiges of the Spanish defeat of Granada against the Muslim Moors. Spanish conquistadors in the Americas imagined mosques in Mexico and Indians wearing Moorish clothes. Islamophobia was a prism through which Europe's colonial encounters with the Americas was shaped. Acknowledging not just the legacies of the colonial past, but the social, political, institutional, and discursive formations of the imperial present are of vital concern. Along this line, we have another acknowledgement to make this year, and that is the 20th anniversary of 9/11 and the so-called War on Terror. The global war on terror and contemporary formations of imperial power have been justified and legitimated through the promotion of Islamophobia. Now, there's been a lot of scholarly attention focused on unpacking the geopolitical dimensions of these militaristic campaigns and understanding how Islamophobia has been operationalized to justify neo-imperial wars and domestic security policies. So I want to look at things from a slightly different prism and examine how post 9/11 imperial politics manifest in a variety of Islamophobic registers that shape and securitize the realities of Muslims in Western diasporas. And so to do that, I'm going to present three themes from my forthcoming book, Under Siege, Islamophobia and the 9/11 Generation, in order to frame my discussion. So the first theme I'll speak about is Islamophobia as a state of exception. And secondly, the ideological construction of Muslim folk devils. And third, the creation of what I call a securitized habitus. So in relation to the first theme, Giorgio Agamben refers to the suspension of the rule of law in times of emergency as a state of exception. He argues that these conditions are introduced under limited and extraordinary circumstances, but have become normalized and serve as the dominant paradigm of government in contemporary politics. Hallmarks of the state of exception include the practices of extraordinary rendition in countries like Canada and the United States, the use of security certificates as part of Canada's Immigration and Refugee Protection Act that has effectively led to the dismantling of the rights of non-citizens in this country through indefinite detention, along with the practices of secret trials and secret evidence. Now, these techniques of governance perform also a discursive function that transforms a peaceful citizen into an outlaw. Political and ideological categories such as the radical, the jihadist, are coded into an index of suspicion that informs the practices of racial and religious profiling. These deviant identities are interpolated into the discourse of a security industrial complex as the apparatus through which post 9/11 governmentality and exceptionalism operate. In the post 9/11 state of exception, military and security communities, along with academics and the media, function as part of a security industrial complex, where Muslims in particular can be profiled, studied, policed, disciplined, and indefinitely detained. Racial securitization is part of this phenomenon and links race and the racialization of religion to the security industrial complex as the basis upon which threats to public safety are determined and safeguarded against. Now, increasingly, non-state institutions, organizations, and actors are conscripted into fulfilling the mission of securing public safety and exercising control over all areas of social life. For example, public servants and private citizens are asked to profile and identify individuals and groups that are deviant and may pose risks to public safety and civility. For example, security agencies have called upon mosques and religious organizations to be partners in public safety and help weed out extremists in their midst. Civil society participates in the supervisory networks conducting profiling and surveillance. Schools, universities, community organizations are recruited to perform surveillance practices in ways that extend the disciplinary function of the state. For example, programs developed for the purposes of countering violent extremism, such as the Prevent policy in the UK, have enlisted preschool teachers to help identify potential radicals among the toddlers they care for. In the US, the American Civil Liberties Association documented how the American government is recruiting businesses and individuals in the construction of a surveillance society. These programs widen the reach of the security industry by asking the public to profile their neighbors and report on who they deem to be out of place or potential threats. Now, of course, racial biases are deeply embedded into the judgments and assumptions underlying these practices and are a driving force shaping public policy and security practices. The disciplinary architecture of the security industrial complex regulates surveillance practices through what Bigot has referred to as the panopticon dispositif, or what we know as a disciplinary apparatus. According to Bigot, the panopticon involves a collection, quote, a collection of heterogeneous bodies of discourses on threats, immigration, enemy within, immigrant fifth column, radical Muslims versus good Muslims, exclusion versus integration, and so on. These ideas reinforce the belief that a profile can be generated to ascertain people who are potential risks. As Bigot notes, and I quote, a skin color, an accent, an attitude, and one is slotted, extracted from the masses, the unmarked masses, and if necessary, evacuated. So these processes of sorting and creating typologies of abject difference are part of the new racial and cultural eugenic practices that govern national borders. These ideologies and conceptions of social deviance manifest in what Stanley Cohen dubbed the folk devil. And that is the second theme I'm now going to examine. So folk devils operate as scapegoats and are blamed for a variety of social problems. Cohen argues that society labels rule breakers as belonging to certain deviant groups, and that, quote, once the person is thus typecast, their acts are interpreted in terms of the status quo to which they have been assigned. Now, according to Cohen, there's three primary ways that a folk devil archetype is manifest. The first process is the symbolization of the folk devil, who's portrayed through a singular narrative that becomes a popular indicator for deviance. So right away, we can see that the negative essentialism of the deviant Muslim archetype is a quintessential illustration for this point. And there's numerous examples that we can refer to in both popular media and other kinds of Islamophobic rhetoric and discourses that are also echoed by the state and are manifest in some of the policies I was mentioning. The second manifestation of the folk devil archetype refers to the controversies surrounding folk devils that become exaggerated, distorted, fabricated, and are used to fuel a moral and symbolic crusade. Now, for example, the Islamophobia industry in the US and Canada has been fueled by campaigns of misinformation, deceit, and salacious lies about Muslims as the fifth column or as an Islamist Trojan horse that seeks to overthrow Western civilization. These discourses are purveyed and popularized through mainstream media as well as far-right social media in ways that create moral panics and normalize and heighten Islamophobia. And then this, of course, results in things like hate crimes and other forms of backlash. Now, the third part of the folk devil dynamic involves predicting future degenerate and deviant actions based on stereotypes generated about vilified subcultural groups. So, for example, security agents rely on markers of Muslim identity as predictive of pathological behavior. So again, Muslims are marked in that way in terms of how Muslim identities and Muslimness can be read as predictive of future degenerate and deviant actions. Also, anti-veiling policies are underwritten by the civilizational danger posed by the Muslim presence, as embodied by what Razak has referred to as the imperiled Muslim woman. So the Muslim folk devil, therefore, plays a key archetypal role in post 9/11 security discourses, policies, practices as an emblem of deviance and risk. Now, I contend that the mechanisms of the security industrial complex result in a securitized habitus that impacts the behavior and dispositions of targeted groups. And this is the third theme I'm now going to discuss. So Bourdieu's theory of habitus refers to specific socializing norms and tendencies that guide thought and behavior within specific groups and subcultures. Habitus is enacted in the way that, quote, the social order is progressively inscribed in people's minds through cultural products. Now, these can include educational practices, language, values, classification systems. For example, Sunaina Myra argues that there's a particular subjectivity and an imperial feeling to the post 9/11 era that transcends the global war on terror and is connected to the material and political structures of power that are evident in everyday life, pop culture, migration, labor, and the formations of national belonging. In this way, I contend that the post 9/11 condition in the West has created a specific securitized habitus. Muslims and society at large have been conditioned into this fraught environment and the ideologies and practices produced by it. According to Foucault, quote, constraints, controls, mechanisms, or surveillance that play themselves out in disciplinary techniques are charged with investing themselves in the behavior of individuals. So we're starting to look at how these dynamics are internalized and in turn produce specific behaviors, affective responses, and shared experiences of alienation. For Muslims, one of the manifestations of the securitized habitus results in the ontological condition of being under siege and constantly aware of how you are perceived by others. This vigilance results in making conscious or unconscious decisions to modify one's clothing, bodily comportment, and behavior, smiling more so as to not be seen as threatening, checking what you might be carrying with you when you are traveling that could be deemed suspicious. Now, we're all socialized into navigating airport security and automatically taking off our shoes, packing our personal care products into tiny bottles in transparent plastic bags, and being cooperative with security guards or being wary of the person sitting next to us that's speaking Arabic. However, not everyone is socialized into being regarded as a potential threat. The way that racialized Muslims and anyone perceived to be Muslim understands themselves to be suspect by others. Myra refers to this as surveillance effects that the 9/11 generation experienced through the normalization of these practices in their daily lives. So she's referring to this generation of Muslim youth that have grown up under the specter of the war on terror and its implications and the backlash that they have consumed and the negative ways that Muslims have been constituted as the folk devil, and they generally don't know much about the world prior to this. And that is also the topic of my forthcoming book on Islamophobia and the 9/11 generation. So what I have found in my research is that there's an internalization of this regulatory gaze, which results into a panopticon of self-surveillance, where individuals become self-surveilling subjects, avoiding suspicion by second-guessing and curtailing otherwise innocent actions for fear that they might be misread as subversive. Foucault described this effect within a panoptic society where individuals are objectified as subjects that are under constant surveillance and then in turn begin to regulate their own behavior and actions in accordance with those dominant norms. This regulatory gaze is inverted and interiorized and thereby performing the work of government surveillance by the subject themselves. And this is something that I recognized quite a bit in the research that I did among Muslim youth who were constantly thinking about their behaviors, their attitudes, what they say in public, what they do, like not wanting to go and play paintball, at a camp up north because they didn't want to be seen as a jihadist training group or as a potential, orchestrating a potential threat. They didn't want to be seen playing violent video games at the concourses of their universities because they didn't want people to think they were plotting something through these actions. And so this panopticon of self-surveillance has become shaped by this securitized habitus of the post-9/11 context. So in closing, these three themes I've shared unpack how imperial politics create the structural, systemic, ideological, and affective registers of Islamophobia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Jasmine, for a very succinct, brief, but very focused presentation that gives us actually an excellent opening. And I have several questions that I will engage you regarding your presentation. But our next presenter is Professor Mary Breen Smith, which I have introduced earlier. And Professor Mary, if you could please unmute yourself and start your video.
Okay, starting my video, however, can you hear me?
I can hear you fine. I don't see your video.
Okay, I don't, oh, here we are, start video, I got it.
All right, very good.
And
very
you
good.
should be able to see me. I'm terribly sorry that I was late. I mistook the time, so my apologies for that.
Your presentation is titled Terrorism and the Politics of Islamophobia, Examining the Big Questions, and
Yes.
we are keenly waiting to hear you.
Okay, fabulous. I do have a PowerPoint, but I'll actually make that available later rather than trying to struggle
Sure.
with.
Let me ask our technical staff to make you a co-host so you can share.
Okay, I think I'm already a co-host.
Excellent.
So let me screen share.
Very well. You got 22 minutes.
Okay, so can you, are we?
Yes, we can see.
You
Yep.
can see me. Okay, so let me make this bigger. I find that if I use the show, you know, the slideshow, it doesn't work. So I'm just going to do it this way. So that's the title. There is an abstract which I'm not going to trouble you with because it's in the summary of the conference. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to really look at what these big questions that I said I was going to answer might be. And the first one is, in general terms, in looking at security, why is attention not focused on the rise of Islamophobia? Because it has been on the rise. And then secondly, how is Islamophobia understood? And why is far-right terrorism downplayed and not a priority? The third question is, what is the role of the agents of the state, particularly veterans and the police I want to focus on? And then fourthly, why are Muslims and the Irish the only terrorists? And I'm putting the Irish in there because much of my work has been inspired by my own experience, much beyond, before 9/11, growing up in Northern Ireland, where we were the suspect community, where I was arrested at airports for having my passport and my address and so on. So the experience predates 9/11, and it predates Muslims being the target, but actually the Irish from Northern Ireland, particularly, where experienced this from the late 1960s onwards, right up until the 1990s. And then finally, I want to wind up by talking about race in the concept of security and what I call the securitized neo-colonial mind. And before I get into the talk here, I just want to point out that I have actually written in an earlier life an article in which I described the suspect community, not as an actual embodied community of people, but actually as an imagined community, much as the imagined nationalist community, imagining yourself as Irish or Egyptian or whatever, but that we don't imagine ourselves to be suspect, although we can, given what we've just heard about the internalization of suspectness. But actually, the suspect community is created in the securitized imagination of the general public. So you don't need to be a Muslim to be a suspect. You must look like a Muslim to somebody who has a securitized imagination. The person who's looking at you with the securitized imagination at their disposal must see you as a Muslim, and therefore you become a suspect. You may not be a Muslim, as a matter of fact. So that's the background to what I want to say. So I'm looking at suspectness, in this case in relation to Muslims, but informed by my own sensibilities of having been in that position in a prior time. Okay, so very quickly running through the slides. Why is attention not focused on the rise of Islamophobia when we know, and I'll make the slideshow available so you can see what the rise of Islamophobia has been. Hate crime has risen by 40% from 2016 on, and it continues to rise. And 92% of hate crime is religiously targeted at religious groups. And overwhelmingly, that religion is Islam. So we know that hate crime in the UK is targeted at Islamophobia, and that we have 70 large amounts of Islamophobia targeted at Muslims, and 61% of US Muslims repeatedly experienced religious-based discrimination compared to other groups. So we see that as a rise both in the US and in the UK, the rise of Islamophobia. And what I want to then say is, how is Islamophobia understood? And I read a great deal of security policy documents, both in my current role, which I should say that I'm speaking here in a personal capacity, not in my official role, because I am the government appointed observer on the Justice and Security Act, which is a piece of counter-terrorist legislation. But how is Islamophobia understood in the documents that come before me? And Islamophobia is seen as dangerous, not because of the damage it does to Muslims, but because the alienation of Muslims is seen as a driver of radicalization. In other words, Islamophobia is dangerous not primarily to Muslims, but to the rest of us who are not Muslims, because Muslims will be enraged by Islamophobia to the point where they will attack us, white people. So this is a theme that runs through many of the documents, that actually, yes, we ought to be, we're nice people after all, so we need to be worried about Islamophobia because we're liberal and so on and so forth. But really, again and again, this trope comes up of Islamophobia being dangerous to the rest of us because of what it will provoke Muslims to do. And there's a quote there, which I won't trouble you with. You can read it at your leisure. There's scant attention to the effects on Muslim victims. And the focus quickly focuses on Muslims as perpetrators. So Islamophobia, I contend, is seen as something that makes Muslims even more dangerous to us. Okay, so then, the contemporary security risks then in the US and the UK is the other puzzle that we have to look at, because actually there's been a huge shift in recent times, relatively recent times, from about 2004, 2005 onwards. Terrorist attacks emanating from Muslim populations or Muslim radical groups have been on the decline in comparison to the huge rise of right-wing terrorism, far-right terrorism. So we have 40% of all arrests in the UK under terrorist legislation have not been of Muslims, but of white people. Only a third were of Asian appearance, and the largest decrease, indeed, of arrests have been in that category of those of Asian appearance, i.e. Muslims. The increase, in fact, has been in right-wing terrorists, and white people are the people who are arrested in that regard. Yet the image of the terrorist, when we talk about terrorism, the image still maintained, the image is still persisting as that of the brown person. So the UK government's counter-radicalisation programme PREVENT reported that 45% of those at risk of radicalisation and in need of intervention were referred due to Islamism, as they call it. But 44% were referred due to right-wing extremism. And this is a 36% increase for right-wing extremism within a very short period of time. Yet the figures for Islamism, as they call it, is on a downward trend. Yet this is not somehow hasn't entered the mainstream discourse, to my knowledge anyway, or certainly in my observation. Let's move to the United States for a moment. In 2018, 78% of attacks within the US were due to white supremacy. 16% were due to anti-government extremism. 4% were due to incel extremism. If you don't know what that is, I'm happy to tell you. It's these radical, they're involuntary celibates. They're men, they're misogynistic men who attack women. 2% were due to domestic Islamic extremism. And you can see again here that white supremacists were responsible for the great majority of killings. 5 of the 17 incidents involved shooting sprees that caused 38 deaths. So these are mass killings by white people, but actually, again, the rhetoric has not shifted to reflect that. And I'm moving very quickly through my slides here so that I can keep within the time limit. The number of hate groups in the United States also rose, and the greatest increase was a 22% growth in neo-Nazi groups. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, there's a marked increase in the increase of white supremacists. And you can see that the storming of the Capitol building recently under the last days of the Trump administration is an illustration of exactly how this has emerged. Identity Europa, which is the most prominent of these groups, it describes itself as an ethno-pluralist group focused on the preservation of white American culture and promoting white and European identity. And it was responsible for 158 of 346 hate incidents on US university campuses, or almost half of all of the total. Okay, so I'm going to, and of course, a lot of these attacks are themselves anti-Muslim, homophobic, anti-Semitic, fascistic, anti-government, and so on. So these are the perpetrators, actually, of Islamophobia in many instances that we're talking about, and yet this is not the focus of concern. So I want to really drill down into that for a moment and find out why that might be the case. Why is this given a bye ball, as it were, and the focus remains on Islam, even though there is still violence emanating from certain groups that are associated with Islam? Nonetheless, there's this other thing going on. Okay, so I've pulled up some images here because I want you to pay attention to the symbolism that's manifest in these images from the United States. And later on, we'll look at similar images from the UK. And what I want you to notice is the prevalence of the stars and stripes, the American flag, in all of these images, and the appropriation of the American flag, and the notion of patriotism that runs through these right-wing demonstrations and these demonstrations of power. Of course, it's alongside, in some cases, the Nazi salute and the swastika and so on and so forth. But the American flag is in there from the get-go. Okay. Now, there's a history to this because right back in 2009, Janet Napolitano commissioned a report on right-wing extremism, and she found things that were really very disturbing, and that in fact right-wing extremism was overtaking any other kind of extremism or terrorism as a major threat within the United States. Now, the report also warned that US Army veterans could be targeted by these right-wing militias for recruitment, as indeed proved to be the case later. What actually happened when Napolitano produced this report in 2009 was that there was all hell broke loose on Capitol Hill. And the mainstream conservatives in the Republican Party and veterans groups alleged that this was a hatchet job that these were that she was giving comfort to people who were people who stood up for the rights of the unborn child, who stood up for anti-immigration policies and so on, and they called for her resignation. The report, to cut a long story short, was buried, and they were enraged by the idea that in fact she was linking she was proposing, or there was an implication in the report that the free availability of firearms might be something to do with these mass shootings and the various other things that were going on, which for most of us is a no-brainer, but in fact for the right-wing conservatives on the Capitol Hill, it was a very big threat, and the report was withdrawn. However, if you want to read it, I've put the link in there on the slide. The aftermath of this was the work to document domestic terror incidents associated with white supremacy and Christian identity was shelved. It didn't happen. It wasn't seen as a priority, and people who were doing it were largely in the NGO sector, the Southern Poverty Law Center, the Anti-Defamation League, and so on. Those are the people who collect statistics nowadays. But within the FBI and other organizations, the political climate doesn't allow for that kind of work to be ongoing and to be showcased. So the reports are systematically, up until recently anyway, they've been systematically sidelined when they are available. And certainly if you want a career in the United States in security, you do not highlight right-wing extremism. Now let's move to the UK. And here we see the equivalent images from the UK of, this is the first slide here, is in Helmand province, and it's a British Army regiment who are standing in front of the Union flag, making a Nazi salute, and they're associated with a football team in Scotland, which is also anti-Catholic. And then on the right, you have another bunch of former soldiers protesting that Soldier F has been prosecuted for the killings on Bloody Sunday. And similarly here you have, I beg your pardon, you have another demonstration where they're going to censor Islam, not speech. And I should also say, by the way, that back in the US, when I was talking about the suppression of the reports on right-wing terrorism, one of the arguments that was used in the United States is that there's a constitutional right to free speech. So hate speech against Muslims ought to be protected, so the argument goes, because it's a constitutional right, we presume, of white people in the United States to say what they want, and free speech is sacrosanct. Here you have a similar call in the UK, and you can see the Islamophobia here emerging. Britain first, no more mosques in the UK. So what I'm pointing to here, both in the US case and the UK case, is the appropriation of the symbols of patriotism and nationalism by the far right has meant that the British values that are often held dear by mainstream British society and political rhetoric are appropriated by the right wing. And when the UK government comes to define extremism, what they're actually saying, a quote here from a 2015 document says, vocal or active opposition to fundamental British values. So to oppose British values is in itself extremism. Yet the right wing have appropriated the idea of British values and British nationalism and the flag and so on and so forth. So it makes it into an us and them argument in which we are the ones with British values, we're the British people, and they are the ones who are in opposition to that. They are the other, they are the Muslims. Or in the previous case, they are the Irish terrorists. I'm suggesting here that there's something to do with this idea of Britishness, and indeed as we move on, the idea that you would decry anyone who would applaud Britishness and use the flag
is
somehow resisted. And you see indeed in the current British Prime Minister, the idea that colonialism, for example, is something to be condemned is something that has been discussed recently in the British Parliament. And in fact, colonialism has contemporary fans in the British Parliament. The idea that the British Empire was really quite a good thing is something that's been voiced again recently within British political rhetoric. And therefore, it's very difficult for in that political climate for far-right terrorism, who adopts and uses some of these same ideas to be called terrorists. In fact, they're not called terrorists very often. They're called domestic extremists, because they're not terrorists or the other. And these people are our guys. They're just a little bit more extreme. So the language is very often reserved. The language of terrorism is very often reserved for the other. And I just want to really return to that point at the end, because what I want to do now is actually to look at very briefly, because I think I'm running out of time, Sammy. Would that be right?
No, you've got about 5 minutes.
I've got about 5 minutes. Okay, so really quickly, and I will send you the PowerPoint, and you can go through these at your leisure. But really to look at that earlier assertion made by the Napolitano report on extremism, that veterans particularly would be targeted for recruitment by right-wing groups, has proved to be prophetic. In fact, they have targeted veterans in the United States, and we find that veterans have joined, and we see this in the recent storming of the Capitol building in Washington, where in fact there were people there who were Army veterans, who were serving police officers amongst the people who stormed the Capitol. And the evidence was there several, a decade and a half ago, that this was actually a trend that was going on. A review of FBI white supremacist extremist cases from October 2001 to May 2008 identified 203 individuals with confirmed or claimed military service active in extremist movements at some time during the reporting period. Similarly, in the police, 3.5% of people surveyed in a survey in 2012 in the police had been approached to join an extremist organization, and 7% of soldiers knew another soldier whom they believed to be a member of some of these extremist organizations. So I'm actually going to look at the UK veterans and the police. And the situation in the UK is somewhat unknown, because the UK Ministry of Defence is resistant to conducting similar inquiries within the army and the police in the UK. So we don't actually know the situation. However, we do, there's emerging evidence from time to time of a police officer arrested for some crime that he's committed in association with the right-wing group. And there's a group called Hope Not Hate, a UK-based anti-extremist group, who has reported that they have helped 10 far-right members infiltrate the, they claimed, they've interviewed a far-right activist who said that he had helped 10 far-right members infiltrate the British Army. So again, the trend is there. So then I want to return to the question of why are Muslims and previously the Irish the only terrorists? And not these other people who are extremists. And what I want to say is that the label is rarely used against right-wing terrorists, right-wing terrorists, because of the points that I've made earlier. The association with us, the hegemonic mainstream that is the population to be secured, and when members of that population resort to terror tactics and take up arms and do harm to other individuals, they're still ours. They might be extremists, but we're very reluctant to name them as terrorists. And of course, this has implications for the disposal of these crimes when they come before the criminal justice system, because we know that the most severe penalties for acts of violence and terror are reserved for those who wear the label of terrorist, because if you're labeled a terrorist, you can be processed under anti-terrorist legislation, whereas if you're not, you're processed under the ordinary criminal law, and the penalties are much lesser. That is the drift, I think, and that's a concern I have, continuing concern that I have, not just in the United States, but also in the UK and contemporary Northern Ireland. Let me just see, there's a little quote that I wanted to, I think, there's a quote here from Abu Bakr in 2017, the alleged unwillingness by state actors and the media to unequivocally label a phenotypically white person as a terrorist is historically connected to the global institutionalization of white privilege, structural and hegemonic conditions of word politics which uphold white privilege. And that's something that I think he summarized very neatly, what I construe to be the case. Therefore, I want to wind up by saying that mainstream conservative hegemonic conceptions of security security itself is seen to be the prerogative of those who deserve to be secured, and the risk is the risk to a hegemonic white state with a majority white population. Risk is deemed to originate with the other, who is identified through the lens of power and politics, but also of race. Security isn't the security of the entire population, but rather the security of the dominant group and of the state itself. The security of minorities, the security of Muslims and of others of any kind is dispensable in the interests of the greater good. And this greater good, of course, is this security of the hegemonic white state and the majority white population. And this is consistent, I would argue, with the historical involvement of Western states in imperialist and colonialist and settler colonial nature of some more recent states allied to the West. So this is a historically consistent line. And finally, this is my final slide. The inevitability and the toleration of the insecurity of the suspect other effectively reinstates the dynamic of racial subordination. So the idea that you can dispense with the security of Muslims is the reinstatement of a dominant subordinate relationship with a population by another population. The toleration of far-right violence by law enforcement, and indeed their implication in it, and counterterrorism efforts serves to reinforce this hegemonic racial ordering. I'm arguing it's a racial ordering as well. And for those of you who are worried that I'm a white person and I've mentioned the Irish, we do know that race is a social construct, not about skin color, just to put that in. Terrorism is a political construct, and the way the threat it poses is framed and managed functions to serve to consolidate and maintain a particular domestic and international order. And hegemonic notions of security replicate and rely on white supremacism, and in turn, white supremacism is integrated into common sense and practitioner notions of security, both in terms of how Muslims are regarded as suspects, how Blacks are policed in the United States, and how the security of others is exceptionalized. So that's the end of my presentation. I did, for the benefit of those who wanted to know what an incel was, I have a slide there that summarizes it. I'm not going to go through it, but there we are. So thank you for that, Sammy.
Thank you so much, Professor Breen Smith, for an excellent presentation. We will engage in Q&A shortly. You know, okay. I have a lot to unpack there. Our final speaker is Professor Ramon Crossfield from the University of California in Berkeley. Let's see if we can get his presentation going. Professor Crossfield, Ramon.
topic I would like to cover, the topic I would like to cover is precisely try to go over the geopolitics of war on terror. So let me back off a little. After 1945, we have the Cold War. I mean, we have basically the main enemy for the U.S. empire was the Soviet Union, and the military-industrial complex was focused on the anti-communist propaganda and the anti-communist warfare, and they were building all kind of military equipment, etc., in relation to this, Cold War against the Soviet Union. That became a hot war in the periphery of the world economy. That is, a lot of the war with the Soviet Union was not done against the Soviet Union. I mean, the Soviet Union and the USA were not fighting themselves; they were fighting indirectly through third world countries. So you have the Korean War, and then later you have the Vietnam War, okay, and then you have the war in Afghanistan, and so on, and these are wars that long-lasting wars that in many ways the US empire knew they were not necessarily going to win them, but there was this machine of the military industrial complex pushing forward for this kind of wars, because that's a way of capitalizing and justifying the transfer of taxpayers' money to their bank accounts through what? Through the U.S. imperial state purchasing weapons in the name of fighting a war somewhere else. Okay, so while the Cold War was going on, you have a huge increase in the military industrial budget. Now, to understand the war on terror, we need to go over this geopolitical context, okay, to make sense of what's going on, or why the war on terror happened, and why the target were the Muslims, are still Muslims. And where is the Islamophobia coming from? What is the agenda, okay? And what happened was that while the Cold War was going on, the military-industrial complex had a good excuse to keep pushing for increasing the U.S. Defense Department budget. And while this was moving on, and while the USA was involved in wars, almost every year involved in a war, over the Cold War years, they were involved in wars in many parts of the world. While this was going on, it was very easy to justify to keep the military, the Defense Department budget increasing, and for people not to dare to question the idea, or to throw down the idea there in the Congress, in the plenary of the Congress, like, "Oh, why don't we cut the expenses in the military, in the Defense Department, and transfer these resources for other things that are needed by the people?" But this the lobby of the military industrial complex in Washington is so huge that it's a win-win situation for them. They put money in the electoral candidates in Congress, both Democrats and Republicans. So they never lost. I mean, they're always, imagine how powerful it is that nobody dares in the floor of the Congress to, in the moments of huge deficits of US government, now in the trillions of dollars, before in the billions of dollars, nobody dared to put the question, why don't we cut the resource, the budget of Defense Department to pay some of these debts, or for educational needs or health needs of the population, whatever, nobody dares to even raise as an idea or as a question in the floor of the Congress. That's how powerful it is. It's so powerful that it's a non-issue that the budget of the Defense Department should keep growing, okay, and should keep increasing, and And if there's no war, they invent a war because they need wars to keep justifying this, okay? So when the Soviet Union basically imploded in 1991, for many reasons I don't have the time to develop here, it imploded, then suddenly the US empire, and especially the military industrial complex of the USA, which is a very powerful economic, political, military power base of the US empire, suddenly they lost the justification of the enemy. That is, the enemy is not there anymore. So what's the point of keeping a Defense Department budget growing and so huge? And it was a moment where they were afraid someone could come up and say, hey, why don't we cut this in half for other needs? And they became, in a sense, they went into panic about this because they have no enemy to justify to keep the budget growing, in Defense Department. Because as you know, all this budget ends up in contracts for the military industrial complex, all these industries that are like corporate welfare. They have corporate welfare. Really, the state is the one subsidizing these companies because these companies cannot just go to a shopping mall to sell these weapons. These are too expensive, and therefore the only way they can make money is by selling it to governments, especially U.S. government. The next thing that happened once the demise of Soviet Union in 1991 was a debate inside the Pentagon that became a public debate in the US about who is the enemy, who is the new enemy. They needed very rapidly to find an enemy. And there was, in the early 90s, a funny debate because the Air Force was saying the enemy is China, because, of course, in a war against China, the Air Force will have the upper hand, and therefore they will have a bigger piece of the pie, okay, in terms of Defense Department budget. And then came the Navy. I said, no, the enemy is the drug cartels bringing drugs through the oceans to the shores of the USA, Atlantic and Pacific Ocean. So here the naval, the Marines, the Navy will have the upper hand in the budget. And then came another enemy that was being discussed there, which was that coming now from the army, that the main enemy were the migrants and the cartels and drugs crossing the border between Mexico and USA. And so there was this debate going on in the early 90s about who is the new enemy. And the problem was that the three main fractions or factions of the Pentagon, the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force, they couldn't agree on this. They were fighting each other because depending on who was the enemy, one of these branches would get more money than the other, and so they were fighting about this, trying to get the most they could, from the U.S. Budget, and then this fight went on for several years until the famous article of a professor from Harvard who came and said, hey, calm down. I have the solution here. And I have a solution where we will have an enemy where everybody here will be happy because everybody will have a role here. And that was the famous article, first an article, later a book by professor from Harvard, Samuel Huntington, who has a career in the USA for many years of a conservative thinker back in the 70s, Trilateral Commission, multinationals, and US is a think tank of multinational and US empire. He was one of the leading figures back in the 70s, one of those who will justify any atrocity in the name of the interests of USA, who will justify keeping authoritarian regimes in the third world and so on. People that that were involved also in the coup d'etat in Chile, in many coup d'etats around the world, And this guy came up and say, hey, the solution is this one, clash of civilization. And what now that the Cold War is over and we don't have that enemy, we invent a new enemy. And now the new enemy are the Muslims, okay? And so he's going to call it a clash of civilizations. This clash of civilization is going to, in a sense, come up with the construction of a new enemy that will justify the increase in the what Juan Bosch describes pentagonism, how for this military industrial complex to capitalize even more. And if you look at the last 30 years, you see how the military budget of USA, the Defense Department, has multiplied, has escalated, okay? Because then in the name of war on terror, then they in many ways invented this new enemy. And in the name of this, they went and invaded many countries and those destroy these countries. That's what really happened. They destroyed these countries. And what was happening is that they, through these wars in the name of the war against terror and that kind of thing, then they went to Iraq, or they went to Afghanistan, or they went to, and then Syria later, and then Libya, and then, and so on. And you have all this military intervention destroying countries, basically destroying the country. So you could see that there was not even an attempt at controlling in the old fashion of imperialism, in a colonial or neocolonial way, this country. It was more like a devastation, and to take the main resources and let the rest of the country fall apart. Okay, so they were not even trying to practice the old forms of colonialism, of having colonial administration, put some order, etc. It's chaos. They're using chaos in these countries, destroying the countries, leaving them into a eternal, perpetual civil war and warfare, in order to then capitalize by keep justifying the transfer of resources from taxpayers' money into the military industrial complex. So you have not millions, not billions, you have trillions with a T, trillions of dollars now transfer, okay, to the military industrial complex. And of course, Islamophobia here, if in the Cold War, the discourse was anti-communism, was the ideology used to mobilize the public opinion and to persuade the public opinion and the politician, the people, of the need to increase the military budget of the USA, the Defense Department, and intervene in many countries militarily to, basically keep justifying the increase in the budget. Now, in this post-Cold War era, the main discourse is going to be not anti-communism, but Islamophobia. And Islamophobia is going to be the main ideological tool that is going to be mobilized in order to justify all these things, and of course the complicity of U.S. empire with some of these Takfiri groups and some of these Islamic terrorist groups goes back to the war of Afghanistan, and you could see the complicity of USA in the fabrication of this group in alliance with the Saudis, Saudi Arabia, who provide the ideological tool of certain versions of Wahhabism that becomes, in a sense, the ideological tool for the Takfiris. And then you have, of course, the Zionist agenda here, that for the Zionists, it becomes a very important element to destabilize countries around the region that they perceive as a threat to their interests. So Islamophobia is what is to war on terror what anti-communism was to the Cold War. Okay, and so over the years now, we have war on terror. We have now 20 years of war on terror. We could see how this has weakened over time the U.S. empire, because the U.S. empire have entered into a kind of labyrinth of without any exit, okay, of debts, huge debts of the federal government. And these debts are not only deficits that have to do with the federal government not being able to pay its accounts, because they are in a structural deficit. USA is not anymore getting the incomes it used to have in the past, but also is the drain of resources and money that all these wars have created, that have, in a sense, transferred trillions of dollars in resources, in money, in capital to all these military industrial companies, making billions of dollars in profits every year. Okay, while the population is being impoverished, while the country is going, basically becoming weakened, because the federal government has now $28 trillion in trillion with a T in deficits. It's the most indebted country in the world. And then, this is creating now a situation that is inside the USA, is creating all these contradictions that is making its, in a sense, effectiveness, having lost all these wars in the Middle East, in South Asia, having lost the wars and going nowhere there. I mean, in a sense, the question for them is not, for the military industrial complex, not anymore winning a war, or it's not anymore the long-term interest of the U.S. empire. For these industries is, how can I make a profit tonight, okay, without having any concern about the future of U.S. empire or U.S. economy or anything like this. So they just want a war tonight, and whoever produces a war for them, they are happy. That's why they're so happy with the Zionists. That's why they're so happy with Saudi Arabia, because these people are fabricating war after war. And for the military industrial complex, it's great for them to have these allies that are delivering wars where they can make more money, and where they can come back to the US government to pass the bill and say, we need more money to keep producing more weapons, more bombs, more airplanes, more whatever, okay, more tanks. And and so we need to, when we talk about Islamophobia today, we need to, in a sense, stop seeing this as a religious issue. Okay, it has nothing to do with religion. It's not a lack of understanding of the empire about Islam, or a lack of understanding of the West about Islam. It's not about that. It's about imperialist, a fraction of the US empire's interest, in this case, the military industrial complex, that is a very powerful power base of the US empire. And that they look how they don't care if you're a Muslim or not. They have allies that call themselves Muslim, okay, as long as they go along with their policies. They don't care if you're a Muslim or not. They're mobilizing Islamophobia as a way to justify a war on terror, because through Islamophobia, then they create in the public opinion of the West that for them is strategic, because these are the populations that are going to consent to increases in military budget and so on. and going along with these military adventures. So they're going to, for public consumption in the public, among the population of the West, they're going to fabricate this Islamophobia hysteria, okay, to create, in a sense, a public psychosis or a public hysteria to demand or consent to the military adventures and to the expropriation of resources from the population and transferring all of them in the trillions of dollars to Defense Department and military industrial complex. To consent to this, Islamophobia, Islamic terrorism, war on terror, all this stuff comes in. But from the logic of military industrial complex, they don't care if the war is lost or not. What they care is if there is a war going. So if there is no war, they fabricate war. If they lost a war, then they find a way to create a new one. So we need to pay attention to this because, in a sense, the war on terror now as a rhetoric have been exhausted to the point that now, having lost the wars in the Middle East, U.S. empire, now, in a sense, they are in a situation where the rhetoric of war on terror is becoming more and more weakened and less people taking it seriously among the public opinion, given the crisis going on, internal crisis inside the U.S. empire. And therefore, they're entering now a terrain of contradiction and a terrain of problems, especially with the COVID-19 crisis. U.S. in 2020, U.S. empire, in a sense, went into a huge crisis, a Great Depression. We are now in a Great Depression. This is not a recession. It's a world Great Recession with the USA as its epicenter. Also, USA as the epicenter of the pandemic, with largest number of people passing away and largest number of people sick in the world. And USA has invested $4 trillion into transferring resources to the 1%, if you remember a year ago, during the crisis of COVID-19. So they were basically bailing out like they did in 2000, in the crisis, financial crisis 2008 and 9. They bail out Wall Street, they bail out the 1%, they bail out the banks and the corporations. And that's what they did again in the COVID-19 crisis, where they transferred $4 trillion with a T to the 1%. So we're talking about the increase in the deficit of U.S. empire has gone huge. And in the middle of this crisis, USA have become now, have gone down to become the second economy after China. The rise of China is here now with a force. And China now is the number one economy in the world right now. And USA is, in a sense, a declining empire. And therefore, the scenario for the next decade is we're talking about a decline of U.S. empire with, in a sense, the rise or the internal fight that could turn into a civil war between two forms of white supremacy that I don't have the time to discuss here. One is the multicultural liberal form of white supremacy, which is the one represented by Biden and the Democrats, or certain sector of the Democrats, and the form of white supremacy of going back to the good old days, quote unquote, of let's make white America great again, and go back to the old forms of apartheid represented by Trump. But the problem they're having is that now all these white supremacy militias, etc., that the Trump administration took out of the closet, they're not going back to the closet. These people are there, they're out. And you saw the uprising in U.S. Congress in January 6th, what happened there. And these people are there, and therefore we're we're seeing a situation where the decline of U.S. empire could be ugly, and there is a high possibility of a civil war. And in terms of the consequences of all of this for war on terror, is that now there are many people in the USA that are realizing that the main terrorist problem had nothing to do with Muslim or anything like that. It has to do with the white supremacist militias in the USA. And now this is challenging the war on terror narrative in a very strong way. So I'm mentioning this because, in a sense, what we're seeing these days is the crisis of the war on terror, the decline, the consequences of 20 years of war on terror, throwing resources to military industrial complex and increasing the US deficits and destroying the US economy, basically. And now the US empire being in a very weak position and becoming a secondary declining power in the world. And now what you have in the next years is the struggle inside empire in terms of the different solutions to the decline, how to deal with this decline. How can you, in a sense, cope with this? And that's where there is a danger of a civil war in the USA, big time. Within the next 5 to 10 years, it's a big danger that this could escalate into an internal civil war. And that will be, in many ways, the end of US empire. A big civil war inside USA is like the end of US empire. But I will stop here and open for discussion. Thank you very much.
Very well, thank you very much for all three of you, Professor Jasmine, Professor Mary, and Professor Ramon. These were very excellent and thought-provoking three perspectives, three different presentations. We talked about the security industrial complex, the military industrial complex, the role of the right-wing groups in this. So let me ask a few questions, and then we can open it also for others. We have been about 20 years into this Cold War on terror, since 9/11. Obviously, with COVID-19, I don't know what the number 19 always brings there, 9/11, COVID-19. But we had, of course, we shifted a bit about the what's called the new normal. But here we have almost 20 years behind us in the so-called war on terror. And I could also take this story back towards the end of the Cold War, right after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the Soviet Union. I've started seeing all these kind of reports coming from special interest groups, particularly Zionists. There was a particular committee within Congress that was tied to the Republicans called the Committee on Terrorism and Unconventional Warfare, in which at the time they were trying to push this narrative that the new enemy, that's even way before Huntington, this was like 89, 90, that the new enemy is Islam. And then we started to see this shift more and more towards considering Islamic ideology or Muslim groups. So I want to ask the questions about, and we were talking about, the geopolitical aspect. Is Islamophobia something that is a tool that is being utilized, or is it something that is deep within society that goes back even maybe for ages or centuries? If we go back to the Middle Ages and the Crusaders and so on and so forth, is it something endemic, or is it something that was manufactured and fed by different institutions and became more structural because there was a need to create an enemy? And that enemy is going to feed in this security state, is going to feed in this military industrial complex. They needed to find this new enemy, even though that enemy was no match to the to traditional power centers around the world. So that's, the question is, who actually is benefiting? Obviously that has been answered partially here, but I would like to get more elaboration on it. When Jasmine talked about the securitization, this was a prelude so that there are certain interests within society that would like to have control over the lives of the people. Therefore, we start with the minority that would be easy to target and easy to get away with it. And then we can institute these policies that would control the lives of the people, and then we can later on extend it more to the larger population? Was that the real aim, or was there something more at play here? You know, you talked a lot about, you know, these different policies, and I want to see what the consequences are on the larger picture. And with Mary also, she talked about the rise of the right-wing groups, and of course she used a lot of data from different organizations, and we could see that. But how does that play into the state, which is trying to maintain its hegemony not only domestically, but more importantly, when talking about the empire, its hegemony throughout? You know, we're talking about an American empire, and when we talk about decision makers, when we talk about people who actually are trying to preserve the status of the United States, both militarily, economically, as well as globally, how does that play into this role? I mean, are these people getting out of hand? Are these people or is this part of the dynamic within society between, let's say, the fear of the other, which is, you know, the theme of Jasmine, the otherization, I guess the theme of everyone here, of the minorities, but the Blacks or the African Americans for centuries, they have been the target, and they have been controlled or tamed to a certain extent. And then we saw that, you know, other minorities always come to become targets at one point or another, the need for that any domestic enemy. But here, when you try to extend that beyond, because you know, when you talk about Islam, that's a religion, that's a billion plus people. I mean, you're not talking about just simply a few communities who are here and there. So what is the role of the rise of is this something that's being manipulated, or is this something that's getting out of hand? And how is that going to be used? I mean, we saw how Trump was trying to use it. And I wanted for you to elaborate more on the aspect of the role of religion, the role of race, and why the Republicans have been using you know, these kind of trends, you know, particularly, you know, the religious, the evangelicals, and so on and so forth, in trying to achieve what exactly in terms of global hegemony? How is that going to work out, since these people cannot be controlled? And we saw what happened in January 6th in Congress. And for Ramon, if you can elaborate also more, you know, I find it very difficult to believe that there will be some kind of civil war in the U.S. because of the nature of the system. You know, the security state does not allow militias actually to. I mean, this is not the 18th century where you could, you know, you think you can bring a huge army and then you get two armies trying to have a civil war. You know, to me, civil war is about much deeper than that. So, and I think they have been pretty much controlled. I find it difficulty, but maybe you can elaborate more. I don't see how it can happen, particularly if the United States still is the number one force in the world. But now looking at, you know, beyond that, China, the rise of China, certainly a lot of people who are interested in strategies think that the US wasted 20 years in trying to fight the phantom, and that during all that time, China was rising rapidly, and now they find themselves behind. And there is a possibility, distinct possibility even, that China would outpace the US in terms of economic development if it hasn't already. And that is going to bring huge problems strategically and globally to the US, and they're trying to slow it down. How is that? How will the role of Islamophobia, and I mean, obviously that was a phantom, how would that play? Would that lessen it, or would that be just another phase? In other words, I'm trying to find out, maybe from the three of you, what do you think the future of Islamophobia is when we look at this global competition that is shaping up now between the US, China, and possibly even Russia, although I don't feel Russia is at that level, but nevertheless, it is still competing. So I have many other questions, but let me stop here and give each one of you an opportunity to respond, and then we'll take the conversation further. I do have also some questions from the audience, which I will share with you in a bit. Let's start with Jasmine.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Sami. You've given us a lot of food for thought and many questions. I'm just sort of thinking about where to begin. in responding to some of your important interventions and questions. So I guess the issue that you raised about, what is Islamophobia? Is it something that is being, manufactured as a way to shore up various kinds of military or political campaigns, or is it something that has already been endemic to society for some time? And I would say that there is a long history and genealogy of Islamophobia that far predates the War on Terror. And as you mentioned, the Crusades. You can even go further back into, how the Prophet Muhammad himself was victimized, was subject to ostracizing and physical abuse and so on, as a kind of Islamophobia. And so there's many iterations throughout history, different moments through which we start to see Islamophobia being manifest. And we've been primarily talking about the contemporary moment, but there is that longer, those antecedents that provide different iterations of Islamophobia in different kinds of historical moments that are important and are instructive, and particularly in the way that a lot of those historical narratives are being revisited by the far right, white nationalists, and what we call the Islamophobia industry, and how they are relying a lot on historical tropes. The Siege of Vienna, the Crusades, these are all markers that they use, tropes that they use to kind of, continue those historical battles in the present. And they are often relying on those historical contexts to shape their discourses and ideologies and manifestos that we start to see today. So there is an understanding that that historical context has a resonance and a currency in the way Islamophobia is being constituted today by different sectors and by different actors. And so there's many different actors that are promoting and purveying Islamophobia in a variety of sectors. We've talked about the securitization of it. I mentioned a little bit about this sort of Islamophobia industry that has multiple actors that are in different ways promoting various discourses of Islamophobia. In our work in Canada, we've identified about 20 different discourses of Islamophobia, and many of those come from that historical context or are about the, Islamist boogeyman or the Trojan horse of Muslims. There's a lot of different ones that I can speak to. And so there is, an interesting currency in terms of the way Islamophobic ideologies are reproduced and taken up, but they are also leveraged. Islamophobia is leveraged in particular ways, as we've all talked about, in terms of securitization, the security industrial complex, in terms of the military industrial complex, in terms of imperialist wars that we've seen in the aftermath of 9/11. And so it is something that then becomes operationalized and leveraged in those particular campaigns, much as it was in earlier campaigns, if we were to look at the Crusades and so on. And that's why I mentioned, drawing on Alan McHale's work about how, early, Columbus's, for example, landing in the Americas was in his view, was imprinted with the encounters that Europe had already had with Muslims and the fall of Granada and so on. And so they were imagining all of this Muslim presence in what they were seeing in indigenous customs or in, other kinds of cultural dance or dress. They all saw this and referenced it through this prism of their encounters, with Muslims. And so there is a strong, resonance of these ideas. So I think, that partly, I think, responds to, that. And I do, to your question about that and about the racialization, I think, it's the racialization of religion. I think religion is a part of how Islamophobia has become manifest by many of these sectors. One of the common ways in which a lot of groups promote Islamophobia is through the weaponization of the Quran and taking Quranic verses out of context and using those.
If I may interrupt, Jasmine, when look, for instance, Saudi Arabia produced 15 out of the 19 hijackers, yet Saudi Arabia's interpretation of Islam is to the Americans because it accepts American hegemony, it accepts American power. It's not being questioned, even though they go to the, about women and this and that. But in terms of what is called political Islam, it's not really questioned at all. While those who would like to advance or promote an independent policy or, based on Islam, they stop. In other words, religion here is accepted and sometimes rejected depending on the political discourse rather than religious discourse. Am I right?
What I'm saying is that you can't really take religion off the table in terms of how it's used by Islamophobic groups, right? It's leveraged in a particular way and used to, because otherwise, what is it about Muslims that is so, important that we should be categorized and vilified and, become the folk devil, right? It is that adherence to Islam. And so I think it's quite clear in a lot of the discursive practices that we can historically map that there is a central emphasis on various markers to do with Islam, even in the securitization, aspects of it. When I talk about the predictive aspect of the folk devil narrative is, well, if someone is coming with a long beard or wearing a niqab, it's all the markers of Islam that are relevant, or, why are the mosques being securitized? Or, so there are definitely, I don't think we can take that out of the equation, right? And obviously there are the other broader political, geopolitical context, but I think it's a complex, and we can't take that out of the equation in terms of understanding how Islamophobia has become manifest, in my view.
Okay, thank you.
And then yeah,
yes, go ahead.
I'll leave it there.
Okay, I have, I have Mary speak next, but also if you could address this question from Ali Gunesh. He's asking if Islamophobia also have something to do with the neocolonial idea to control Muslim populations. Obviously, that's part of the of hegemonic power. And also, I want to mention, speaking of Irish, that back in '97, when we started fighting secret evidence in the United States, this was a fight for about 3 years right before 9/11, and it was the biggest civil rights issue for us at the time. I was in the States at the time. Is that we started with both Irish and Muslim groups, actually, because both were targeted. That's before the Good Friday Agreement, when everybody was released, and so it shows the political nature of these kind of policies. It's really so that's what I'm saying is that because Britain was pressing the U.S. at the time to treat those who were supporting the Northern Ireland struggle to be also targeted the same way they were targeting Muslims. So I just wanted to mention that indeed was common struggle. But please go ahead. You need to unmute yourself.
Okay, you can hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, fabulous. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of questions here, and I just want to make some general remarks so that I can set out where I stand in all of this. I am in no doubt that there are interest groups and political groupings and interests who try to manipulate Islamophobia, just like they try to manipulate all sorts of other things. And the secret to my attitude to this is the word try, because there are competing interests at work here, even within the military industrial complex, as this previous speaker has pointed out. You've various wings of the military industrial complex competing internally against each other. So it's not a simple matter of somebody sitting in a powerhouse and manipulating things. There's a kind of maelstrom of dynamics going on, I think, where certain people will try to appropriate ideas such as Islamophobia and pursue them for their own interests. But back to my original thesis, I mean, for me, we're living history, and we're living the legacy of previous decades and centuries of history. I mean, I go back to Said as a source in relation to the history of Islamophobia, because these are dynamics of not just domination and subordination within societies, but also the dynamics of domination and subordination between societies, which are historical and go back into the mists of time. And we merely live out the latest iteration of those dynamics. And of course, we attempt to resist them. We, at one moment, may be part of a dominant group, and the history of the Irish people, for example, in the United States and immigrants to the United States illustrates the point that just because you're in a subordinate group and persecuted one day does not mean that in a few years' time you will be part of a dominant group and persecute other people. So these are unfolding dynamics that have historical specificity, but they also have geographical specificity. I'm very resistant to the idea of predicting where these things will go or what the future of Islamophobia might be, because there are so many competing trends in here. And I mean, I'm somebody who was part of the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, and I was also an activist for victims' rights in Northern Ireland. And two things blindsided me in my lifetime. The first was the end of apartheid. I didn't believe that we would see the end of apartheid, but we did. And secondly was the Good Friday Agreement. I didn't think we would see the end of the war in Northern Ireland, and we did. So don't ask me for predictions, Sammy, because I'm terrible at them. All I know is what we must do is be busy in the present, to do what we can to unpick and understand these things, and to stand with the right people at the right time, and stand up for what's right and stand up for justice. That would be my position. I don't believe in conspiracies. I think there are people who try to conspire, but the dynamics of history and the dynamics of the society in which they find themselves usually mitigates against their best laid plans.
I do have a question also for you from one of the listeners. He said, why do you think policymakers try to downplay the white supremacist movements in the West?
Well, I think policy makers try to downplay white supremacist movements. Historically, I think I've laid that out in the United States, the history of the Napolitano report, but also the idea that the US Constitution is there to protect white people. You know, that the US Constitution was written in the blood of the First Nations. You know, I mean, so these, again, we have to locate these things historically and what they mean, whose rights are being protected by the US Constitution. And in fact, what we find now is the US Constitution is used for two purposes. First of all, to protect the right of right-wing militias to bear arms. And secondly, the right of right-wing groups to spout hate speech. So, I mean, when you think about it in those terms, it seems to me that it's very clear that we don't need somebody masterminding this, because it's in the very air that we breathe. We've inherited the air from an historical context in which domination and subordination of imperialism and colonialism was our legacy. We live that out in the present. It's not something that's merely allocated to the past.
Right. Ramon, can you turn on your camera? I
turn on my voice, not my camera, because I'm having some trouble here. But
okay, no problem. No, okay. I understand. I just because of full disclosure, I just tell people that you were hacked, and therefore we had to, shortly before we had to record your speech just in case, so we don't get hacked. But you've been with us so long. Yes, please go ahead and answer the questions.
Yeah, the first thing I want to say is that there is Islamophobia as well as anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, and so on. It's a long-term issue in Western civilization. Okay, so it's been there for centuries. Okay, so it's nothing new under the sun. Now we need to understand the differences in terms of the context, that is the global context and domestic context of countries and so on. So, for example, anti-Black racism, has been there and is there today and is going to be there for a while. Okay, I'm not saying these are eternal things, but there are structural racism in the system we live in, this global system, for the past more than 500 years. I've written about this. For example, anti-Indigenous racism or Islamophobia as a form of racism against Muslims, it's been there also from the early period of the modern world. I have written about this in my essay on the 4 genocides, epistemicides of the long 16th century, where I show the difference between medieval Islamophobia and modern Islamophobia. Medieval Islamophobia was a form of religious discrimination, but modern Islamophobia is racial. It's about the inferiority of human beings and the superiority of others. So that's a marker of race in the modern world. And so it's been there, it's there today, and it's going to be there for a while, especially when you have actors in the, in the domestic arena. There is issues of, white supremacy, white identity, so especially in the West, but also in other parts of the world where you have, Islamophobia, as the Black racism and so on, as central issues of structuring these societies. Now, there is in the international, why is it that Islamophobia becomes an international, it becomes a discourse that replaces anti-communism in the international arena? That has to do with other issues. That has to do with relations of power that I explained in my talk, about how, once the Soviet Union disappears, how for the industrial military complex, they need to invent a new enemy, and et cetera, et cetera. I explained that already. But so we need to go to the geopolitics of the world to understand why at a certain point in histories, Islamophobia becomes something that has been there for a long time, and is going to continue being there in the domestic arena and regional arena of the, domination of the West over the rest, becomes so important in the geopolitics of the world. So it has to do with other factors. So we cannot collapse. We cannot collapse the local with the global, or the global with the local in a mechanical way. We need to understand that there are dynamics at each level of the system. So to answer now straightforward your question, I think Islamophobia will continue being there, especially with actors such as, for example, in the international arena, as Israel. Israel has a special interest, given the conflict that they are facing every day of colonizing, genocidal policies against Palestinians. They need to continue feeding the machine of Islamophobia at a world scale. So that will continue there. It's a powerful actor. They have a lot of influence internationally. They have a lot of influence in the media and in the international arena. So that's going to be there. But from the point of view of United States as a declining empire, Islamophobia will be there and continue to be there domestically. But internationally, the focus is displaced more and more towards competing empires. And those competing empires are not coming from Muslim countries. The competing empires are coming fundamentally, from China and Russia, that are in themselves also Islamophobic empires. Look at the behavior of the Russian Empire towards Muslim in their territory. Look at the behavior of China towards Muslim in their territory. They share this. So the main issue now is displaced, I think, now with this competing inter-imperial struggles and the decline of US empire, the rise of China, etc. That what we're going to see is that at least among the major players of the system, this is not going to be the central point. I think it's going to focus or move the focus away from that into issues related to, anti-Chinese we're seeing now very clearly now they're coming with a very anti-Chinese rhetoric that is very racist in the way they mobilize this. Look at the aggressions against Asian people going these days, almost every day in the US today, and this is going on. I mean, it has to do with, so what I'm trying to say is not that, all these forms of racism are going to disappear. They're continuing. But what is going to happen is that they become, at least in the international geopolitical arena, they're going to become, I would say, Islamophobia, a secondary but still active factor in the world economy today. So this is my short answer. It's a complex issue that we need to tackle from the point of view of, I mean, we cannot say in absolutist term, Islamophobia is over. No, it's going to continue, especially in the domestic arena of Europe, Western Europe, USA, China, Russia. That's still there. It's going to continue there. But in terms of replacing anti-communist rhetoric like it did in the last 20 years, I think that's over. I think they're moving forward now into anti-Chinese rhetoric and anti-Chinese kind of policies rather than Islamophobia. I think this is where they're going now.
Yeah, and I
Anyway.
think we're seeing this now in France very vividly. Well, in the interest, again, because we started a bit late, so we're going to extend this just 10 minutes. So I'm going to give each one of our speakers some final notes, but let me ask a few questions that you can also address within your final closing thoughts. With Jasmine, I want you to address the communities, particularly in the West, the Muslim communities in the West. What do you think they have been missing? What do you think they have been dealing with this phenomenon, the Islamophobia phenomenon, for the past 20 years in the right way? Have they been missing something? Because certainly when I look back, how influential, obviously we have a lot of progress when it comes to certain politicians being elected and all that. But when it comes to confronting, particular policies, you'll find that many communities shy away from being at the forefront of this struggle. I'm looking back at the struggle of different minorities and how they were challenging government. And now we find challenging government hasn't been really at the forefront. I wanted to hear your thoughts about that. And also, if you can address what do you think globally different groups or different governments can deal with the phenomenon of Islamophobia at the global level, the way it's been used. And for Mary, you mentioned certainly that the percentage of terrorism that is associated with Muslim groups or Muslim individuals has been met 2-3% in Europe and the US for consistently right after 9/11. Yet $3 trillion have been spent on this, so-called security state. So can you comment on what's going on here? Is this something that is being utilized and used? Because I know the attempts by the FBI, for example, between 95 and 2001, before the Patriot Act, how they were trying to get legislation and they were failing. They got a little bit in 96 with the immigration bill, but they couldn't get the major things that they were looking for, which would have turned the society into security state. So was that just an exploitation of the situation, or were there genuine fear? But even though Muslims have been the target of these policies and of these legislation, but yet now it can be used against domestic groups. So is this going to be the trend in the future? I know you don't want to predict the future, but is this something that has been done consciously in order to tame the society, control it more, and turn it into security state? Or these are genuine things, genuine policies that governments usually turn to and eventually get relaxed? Or this is something that you think is going to be with it for a long haul? And finally, for Ramon, you touched on the competition between the United States and China. And if you could look at the role of particular Muslim governments, like Turkey, for example, where it is part of NATO, but standing up, sometimes to some of these policies, the role of Iran, for example, and other states, and also those who have aligned themselves with the with countries that are trying to assert more control and hegemony. In other words, give us your 2 cents on the global situation and how Islamophobia is infusing this global struggle. Let's start with Jasmine.
Thank you for those questions. So first, to talk about communities, Muslim communities, and let's say Western diasporas, and I'll speak mostly to the context where I'm in Canada, because that's something I've been researching. In terms of how are the communities responding to Islamophobia, and I would say in our context, and probably that's true in a lot of other Western diasporas where Muslims are largely coming as immigrant populations and still trying to build institutions and within society, and are largely under-resourced in terms of trying to address how to contend with these forms of oppression. And some of what, for example, here in Canada, 3 years ago, we had a massacre in a mosque by a white nationalist who shot dead 6 Muslim men. it took the state 4 years to have a National Day of Remembrance for this tragedy. And we had a motion tabled in government after this called Motion 103 to acknowledge that Islamophobia and religious discrimination, systemic racism exist, and to do something about it. Well, not much has come of that. Right. And especially around Islamophobia, it tends to get left off the table in favor of looking at other forms of racism. And so it's very difficult for communities who are not getting the resources, where we're not, we have very few courses even on Islamophobia in universities. We don't have as much public knowledge or information about this. And then you want marginalized communities to sort of, learn off their backs and be the ones to address this. And so without the resources to be able to support that. So I think we do need to have social movements and funding to be able to properly address Islamophobia and the multiple levels that we need to do. Often communities try to do that through interfaith work, through education, through working with youth, because one of the things that Mary talked about was this, which is quite true, this nexus between Islamophobia and radicalization, and often the kinds of resources that are put in are, put in toward Muslim youth to, let's do things so that they don't become radical, or let's focus on these communities to the extent that which we build their resilience to radicalization, right? As if they are somehow inherently prone toward this. And then, there needs to be these CVE interventions. So this is where the resources are being put, and it's in the wrong place. Communities have a role to play in addressing Islamophobia, but it cannot be strictly on the backs of the communities, and we need to have coalitions. We need to ensure, especially in a lot of the anti-colonial and decolonial struggles, I find Islamophobia is often left out of that table. And as we've talked about the historical colonial legacies that have shaped and framed Islamophobia, we need to be able to connect that to struggles here. So if we talk about anti-Black racism and the police, in North America, we need to talk about the militarization abroad and how that has affected police. Who's training the police in the United States? You have, former IDF that are doing that work. And so we need to look at those broader connections and linkages in order to build coalitions and create a critical mass that has an analysis around how all of these systems of oppression are connected and reinforce and mutually sustain one another. So I think that's important. And just to your last point on the global dimensions, I think Islamophobia, we see various forms of Islamophobic ethno-nationalism. We talk about China and the Uyghurs. We talk about Rohingya and the genocide in Burma. We talk about what's happening in India and in Kashmir, in Palestine. There are so many, iterations of this. It's a global threat. And we also need to understand that through an intersectional analysis. It isn't just about the West's white supremacy. It is about other forms of Islamophobic ethno-nationalism and how those can be co-constructed as well.
Thank you very much. Mary?
Yes, gosh, I'm trying to remember, why did the FBI not get away with basically instituting a security state in the United States? Well, first of all, I think that the FBI, like every other organization, if we think about it in terms of organizational sociology, the sociology of organizations have tendencies within them that pull in one direction or another, and they also have cultures. And so if you take, for example, back to my example of the Napolitano report, it was an FBI report that reported on right-wing terrorism, but it was the legislators in the United States that quashed that. It was the politicians who decided that this was anathema and that they couldn't do it. So in a way, it's not just the FBI. It's actually a whole complex of agencies that make for legislation passing or not passing. But more than that, even if the legislation is on the books, there are rafts of legislation on the books in the United States and in the UK and in Ireland and elsewhere that's never used. So why do we prosecute certain people who have committed acts of terror, for example, under the ordinary criminal law, as I said, and others under anti-terrorist laws? The thing is that human agency is always in the picture. And human agency is multiple and complex and often contradictory. So, I mean, that's why I'm loath to make any predictions about any of this. I think Jasmine is completely right. I think international understanding, looking over the fence at what's going on in our neighbor's backyard and learning the lessons from that, and the fact that the police training, first of all, in the United States is sometimes as short as 6 weeks. That there are international police forces and military forces going in there and doing that training for them. And therefore you have a culture of policing that's being transmitted from one part of the world to another, and which is militarized. I mean, we in Northern Ireland, after the peace process, demilitarized this society. We actually disarmed our police officers. And then I go and live in the United States and I'm completely freaked out by the fact that the police officers are bristling with weapons, and you're scared of being shot even as a white person. So I mean, so the thing is that I think that these things are they're international trends, that we live in a global village. People are moving around the world. Ideas move around inside their heads with them. Cultures of policing, cultures of statecraft move around as well. But more than that, there are these huge arms manufacturers, for example, who need to sell weapons, as a previous speaker has pointed out. There are these other profit-driven organizations who want to make money out of war, and therefore who see war as good business. I mean, we used to joke in Northern Ireland, that business is, and I used to joke as somebody who studies conflict, that business is good, but business is very good. And I'm very happy because I have lots of things to talk about and lots of things to study. And we used to joke about the glaziers in Northern Ireland, because every time a bomb went off, all the windows would get broken. Well, the glaziers were devastated during the ceasefires because their businesses were suffering. People make money out of these things, as has been pointed out. So again, I have to say I'm back to complexity and a little bit of chaos theory in there as well. But also the lesson from my own experiences when I went to live in England in 2005, and I engaged with some of the organizations there that were representing Muslims who were being arrested and treated very badly by the legal system. There at that time, one of the things that I did, which I think was useful, was to introduce some of those organizations to some of the human rights organizations that had been taking statements from people who are arrested in Northern Ireland and documenting them and creating cases which they took to court, and they took the government to court. They persuaded the Irish government to take the British government to court, and so on, because there are battles that can be fought non-violently through the available apparatus that the state makes available to citizens. But actually, quite often, the fear and intimidation that is visited upon populations by things like Islamophobia, paralyze them and render them unable to organize and to get themselves organized to fight back. So I don't know. That's all I want to say.
Thank you, Mary. And the final comment from Ramon, 3 or 4 minutes. Your last comment.
Yeah. Let me begin by saying that there is a lot of, let me put it this way, lack of knowledge of what is going on inside U.S. empire. Inside U.S. empire, there are two factions that we need to understand. What are the logics of these two factions? There is the Brzezinski group, okay, which is the one who was behind the Obama administration. And there is the neocons, what we know as the neocons. The neocons are completely tied with the military industrial complex as well as the Brzezinski group, but they have a discrepancy in terms of how to handle the international arena of who is the enemy. But the people of the neocons during the last 20 years were the ones basically running the show, and they were the ones pushing forward together with the Zionists the agenda for Islamophobia and so on. You have the Brzezinski group that was very influential in the Obama administration and is coming back again in power with Biden, which basically they say, listen, all these things in the Middle East, all these things are like secondary to the main enemy. The main enemy is China. Let's not get confused by this. And there are important emphasis here of differences between these two groups. In the case of the neocons, they're much more tied to in a more direct way with the Zionists, and the Zionists prefer them over the Brzezinski group, even though the Brzezinski group is as Zionist as the others. But because the Brzezinski group is saying, listen, the main enemy is China, let's not waste time with the Middle East, they were calling for negotiation with Iran. You remember a few years back, Obama made a deal with Iran. Whatever we can say about the deal, etc., is very problematic deal. They were trying to cope with the situation in the Middle East, trying to, in a sense, neutralize the situation to focus on China. And that's coming back to power in the US. They're coming back to focus on China. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not going to be continuous conflict and continuous Islamophobic discourses mobilized against what they perceive as secondary powers like Turkey and Iran. But that's not the main priority of at least this administration. This administration priority is China, as well as you could see it in a way being played out by Trump. But what happened is that right now, the budget of the US Pentagon is just completely out of proportion in terms of number, absolute numbers and relative numbers of the federal government. It's a proportion that they have their stomach full. If I want to use that metaphor, they're completely full of their stomach with money and resources. So now the main focus they're not eager to, like they were 20 years ago, or 10 years ago, to keep that budget growing. Now they are eager to focus in a more significant way the money they are getting from the US government to justify better. So now they're focusing on China. China is the main thing now. What happened 4 years from now? I don't know what will happen 4 years from now. That might be, there might be, as I said, an internal civil war. How could that happen? That was a question raised to me by Sami before. This could happen because there are militias organized militarily in the USA calling for the independence of the federal government. In the USA, different from many countries around the world, everybody is armed. Weapons, everybody has a weapon. So, and there are organized militias in many states that as soon as they see with the decline of Trump that the federal government, the struggle for the federal government and the Congress is a lost cause for them, they going back to their old demands, which is what? Independence of Michigan, independence of Wisconsin, independence of Oregon, and so on from the federal government. And this is something that is coming with a force as the crisis becomes more and more the Great Depression in which we are now today. It becomes deeper. It's going to, in a sense, push for more and more this kind of reactions of white supremacy, having in a country such as the USA have no left. There's no left in the USA. So the discourse that is articulating the crisis is the white supremacist discourse. So this is how I see this potential of an internal civil war where some states go through a deep Great Depression, begin to demand breaking with the federal government and trying to secede from the federal government. This is an unfinished question in the USA going back to 19th century, and this could come back with a force. And so, and in terms of the Islamophobia, well, this is going to continue inside the USA. This is going to continue maybe in regional secondary powers, like you mentioned, Turkey, Iran, but that's not going to be the main thing like it was in the last 20 years. The main thing is going to be preparing for a confrontation with China and with Russia too. And so this is coming with a force. That doesn't mean that Islamophobia is going to disappear from the domestic or international arena. It's going to continue there, but it's not going to have the same role it had
in the last 20 years, going to have a more secondary role. But that we should not underestimate. A secondary role is a secondary role and is significant compared to anything else. Why is it that in today, you don't have, for example, the anti-Black racism, which is very strong in the USA, becoming part of foreign policy? You see, why is it that they don't take Africa as a target or something else? Well, in a sense, it has to do with the way they were, the internal forces in the USA. It's a long analysis to explain this, but basically, in the last 20 years, Islamophobia used to work as a way to say, we have this threat, Islamic terrorism, so we need to go ahead in our agenda, et cetera, et cetera. In the case of Africa today, they have, in a sense, intervened directly in Africa, all these Western powers, to plunder Africa, including China today. But in a sense, there's no, they haven't, the invention of an Islamic threat, okay, is something that they use at a moment when they were desperately finding for a solution to the end of the Cold War and finding a new enemy. And there was nothing like this that they could pull up from the box.
We have
okay,
to leave it at that because of time.
From Africa. So anyway, I'll stop here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for our three
Okay.
speakers. This was an excellent panel, and I think it's a great start for our conference. I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. Please send me your address. We have small mementos from the conference. So if you send me your address, we'll mail it to you. You know, this has been virtual, so we don't have applause, but I will applause our three speakers. Thank you so much for wonderful presentations, and I hope to that you would honor us with your presence in the future as well. I want to remind our audience about tomorrow's program. If we can have it on the screen, the second panel will be tomorrow, and it will have 4 speakers. The first, let's see, session 2 will be tomorrow at 5:30 our time, which is, you take 3 hours less, which would be 2:30 GMT and 12 o'clock, 2:30 rather, Eastern time. And the title is Islamophobia and Domestic Control of Targeted Minorities. We're going to have one presentation on manufacturing terrorism. This is one of the tools that's being used to control the communities. And there are 2 other tools, one in Britain called Prevent and one in the United States called Countering Violent Extremism. And then that will be followed by session 3 at 8 o'clock Istanbul time, which is 5 o'clock GMT, or I guess would be 1 o'clock PM, 1 PM Eastern time. And the title of that is Redefining the Global War and Terror, Who is the Terrorist? And we will have a professor from University of Tehran and also one from South Africa. So hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you so much. And sorry for extending this by 10 minutes because we started a bit late. Good night, everybody, and good afternoon for those who are outside.
Can I ask, before you go, please,
Yes.
please pass my good wishes to Naeem from South Africa, and also to Asim Qureshi.
Oh, my pleasure. Absolutely. Thank you so much.
You.
Thank you, Jasmine. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Ramon.
Thank you.
Good
Bye.
night, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.